of time for Dr. Vickers' presentation. So I'll just go ahead and kick us off. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Weeki Wachee Springs, home of Florida's Mythical Mermaids with Dr. Lou Vickers. I'm Katie Kelly. I'm the Special Programs Coordinator here at the Orange County Regional History Center. Although I'm not actually at the History Center today, but I am the Special Programs Coordinator at the History Center. I'll share a little bit of information about our organization for anyone who may not be familiar with us. The History Center is operated in partnership between Orange County and the Historical Society of Central Florida. We're located in downtown Orlando and offer 3 floors of permanent exhibitions, renowned special exhibitions from the Smithsonian, and a variety of interactive, unique experiences and programs for guests of all ages. Support to the Historical Society of Central Florida is vitally important to the center's ability to serve the community and continue to fulfill our mission to serve as the gateway for community engagement, education, and inspiration by preserving and sharing Central Florida's continually unfolding story. There are a variety of ways to support our work, including volunteering, membership, and donations, and all of those things are equally as important. So I will put a link in the chat for anyone who is interested in supporting us, getting involved. We welcome all sorts of support and interest. Today's program is being facilitated as a webinar, so that means that attendees do not have access to your video and audio. We will have time at the end for questions, so please feel free to put any questions that you have for Dr. Vickers in the chat as they come to you. You don't have to wait to the end. I will be on in the background pulling questions out to address at the end, so as they occur to you, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. This program is part of our series of Mythic Creatures programming, inspired by our current temporary exhibition, Giants, Dragons, and Unicorns, The World of Mythic Creatures, and is funded in part by Florida Humanities Council. We would truly appreciate it if you took a few minutes to fill out the survey for this program. For some of you, it may pop up in your Zoom window at the end. For others, you may not receive it until tomorrow's follow-up email that you'll get from Zoom, but there will be a link to a survey in there, just a very brief survey. It helps us to fulfill our grant requirements, and it also helps us to apply for future funding to continue bringing programs like this. So without any further ado, I'm going to, in just a moment here, I'm going to turn things over to our presenter. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lou Vickers. She's been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship for fiction for excerpts from a novel in progress. She's also been the recipient of 2 Florida Book Awards and 3 Florida Individual Artist Fellowships for fiction. In addition to writing Remembering Paradise Park with C. Graham, she has also written the novel Breathing Underwater and 3 other Florida history books, Weeki Wachee City of Mermaids, Cypress Gardens, America's Tropical Wonderland, and Weeki Wachee 30 Years of Underwater Photography with Bonnie Georgiadis, excuse me. So without any further ado, Dr. Vickers, please feel free to go ahead and take it away. I'm going to turn off my camera and mic, but I will be on at the end to facilitate the Q&A, okay?
Okay, that sounds great. I want to thank you and Rick Kilby too for inviting me to participate in this project. Weeki Wachee is a place that I became familiar with when I was a kid in North Florida, and I'm from Chattahoochee, which is famous for the Florida State Mental Hospital. So I grew up in a small town, and the claim to fame was a mental hospital. So of course I have a unique point of view about everything after that. My parents, I had 2 brothers and a sister, so they actually didn't have a lot of money to take us places, but we would kind of stay up in North Florida, and we would go to Panama City Beach, and they had the Miracle Strip amusement park, and we would go over there and play goofy golf and stuff like that. On one of our trips though, I saw a sign for Weeki Wachee. And this is one of those little stickers they would sell to put in your window, your car window. But I saw a billboard about the mermaids, and it really caught my attention. And I was a little kid when that happened. And so I always said the mermaids swam into my imagination and kind of just stayed there. Chattahoochee is next to Lake Seminole. And so we would go swimming out there, and my sister and I would pretend to be mermaids, out at Lake Seminole, and it was all because of the sign. Just seeing the sign was enough for me, and so it kind of stayed in my head. And when I grew up and became a writer, I would always have little references to Weeki Wachee in my fiction. And in fact, I wrote a little story about these 2 sisters that live next to a field that has a billboard, And they kind of lament the fact that they never got to go there. And they thought in their heads, well, it was probably better that we didn't. Things are always better in your imagination. But I finally did go. I was working on a novel on Weeki Wachee. Well, it was actually inspired because I was reading up on the history of Weeki Springs, which is up near where I am. Weeki Springs is a big spring. And I found out that Newt Perry, the man who founded Weeki Wachee, actually worked there. And so I was reading up on some Weeki history, and I saw that it would be a good place to set a novel and to have the mermaid be the granddaughter of one of the women that worked at the spring there. And so that's how I got involved with it. So I started writing, and then of course I had to go to Weeki Wachee, to see what was happening over there. So let me see. Okay, here we go. I was having a glitchy thing there. This is the very first time I went to Weeki Wachee. You can see I look a little bit different. My son in this picture was about 2 years old. He's 22 years old now, so you can get a sense of how long ago that was. And the two people that I'm with are two of the original mer people at Weeki Wachee. On the left is Mary Darlington Fletcher, who is like the original mermaid, and her brother is Ed Darlington, and they took me in. When I met them, everything changed for me. I stopped working on my novel, and I was like, I want to interview y'all. I want to talk to all these older mermaids that were performing. And the reason that they were performing was they had a reunion, and the Weeki Wachee had invited some of the older mermaids to perform, and so they performed, and they were such a big hit that they invited them to come back and to continue performing. So Mary and Ed would pretty much perform at least once a month down there, and they just loved it. Mary became, well, there's Ed. I guess I'll talk about Ed first. This is Ed from one of the reunion shows, and he was a real character. And he was just a very lovely man. And, he ended up passing away. I went to his funeral, but before he did, he was in the hospital, and I sent him a copy of this photograph, and I told him, put it on your bedside so these nurses know who they're dealing with. He was always cutting up about things, but he was a teenager when he started working at Weeki Wachee, performing underwater. And this is his sister, Mary, Mary Darlington Fletcher. And Mary was telling me how when they were children, they would go to Weeki Wachee and swim there. It was just a swimming hole. And so when they went up there one day, they found that the place was roped off, and it really upset them. And so Mary said, we went and found the man who roped the spring off, and it was Newt Perry. And they asked him, well, what are you doing here? This is our spring. And he said, I'm going to sink a theater into the spring, and I'm going to have a mermaid show. And if you want to be part of it, come back next weekend, and I'll do a test. And so they did. They came back the following weekend, Ed, Mary, and some of their friends. And Mary said the test was to swim across the spring and back. And if you could do it without drowning, you could become a mermaid. And so they all became mermaids, and they learned how to perform underwater. But the story about Weeki Wachee goes way back. It goes all the way back to the 20s, to Silver Springs. It's really the story. Weeki Wachee story entwines three springs: Silver Springs, Weeki Springs, and then Weeki Wachee. And this is Newt Perry in the 30s, swimming underwater at Silver Springs. And his family moved to Ocala in the 20s. And so Newt Perry started swimming over at Silver Springs, and he was such a good swimmer that they hired him to be a swim instructor and a lifeguard. And so that's when his vision of underwater performance started, was in the 20s. And so he started doing everything underwater. He just had this great imagination. His imagination, as you'll see as we go through the show here, he really affected a lot of people with his imagination and his visions of underwater performance. This was a photograph that was made, I think that's one of his sisters. This was like in 1928, somewhere in there. And that's underwater. You might not know it's underwater unless you saw the fish, because the water was so crystal clear then that a lot of times it wouldn't look like they were underwater because the water was so clear. This is another photograph of Newt's wife at the time, and sister, and I think sister-in-law. And they're feeding the fish. underwater. And this is a photograph of Newt Perry. This was actually probably a still from a newsreel, because once Newt Perry grew up a little bit, he became intimate with some of the film people. And so you always had these newsreel companies roaming around and trying to find good stories. And so Newt Perry, he was friends with Tarzan. This guy right here, that's Johnny Weissmuller. They're chasing turtles for a film called Underwater Champions. And it was Grantland Rice newsreel company. And so Newt Perry formed these relationships with people in the film industry, and they kept coming back to Silver Springs or wherever Newt Perry was. And they would make these newsreels, which they would then show in movie theaters, before the main feature. So that's, like I said, that's Johnny Weissmuller. He and Newt Perry were really good friends. And there's Johnny Weissmuller and the boy and Newt Perry at Silver Springs when they were making the Tarzan films down there. There's Newt Perry underwater on a bicycle, probably another still from a newsreel. He just decided, his daughter was telling me that, if he saw something that could be done on land, he knew it could be done underwater, and they would just figure out a way to do it. And so they were always coming up with new ideas. And this was a postcard from down there on doing the Apache dance underwater. And these are pretty cool images. Everybody's sitting at the tables. They were pretty elaborate. And some of the scenes they created were very elaborate. Some are more simple. This is just underwater photography at Silver Springs. Cool postcards. And this is where I might have a glitch, but hopefully not. This is a circus that they did at Silver Springs underwater. And I'll just play it. Let me make sure the sound's working here, y'all. Okay, looks like it is. So this was an underwater circus at Silver Springs.
The lovely stretch of water and woodland known as Silver Springs, Florida, is the most perfect setting for underwater photography in the whole of America. As you sail up its tree-bordered reaches, you're amazed at the crystal clearness of the water and the smoothness of the submerged limestone rocks. Today, we're lucky enough to drop in while preparations are being made for a show, an underwater circus. And most of the props you'd expect to find in an earthly circus are being got ready for the depth. Setting up the scenery on the bottom is rather a wet job, so the stagehands wear tin hats to keep the water out of their ears. And while they're going down, they get air by the pumpful. Every bit of scenery has to be weighted to make it stay put, and even the hot dogs will be heavy on the chest. Underwater acting is just one damp thing after another. In a maze of stakes and guy ropes, the circus is taking shape. We know what to do if we feel hungry, but what happens if we feel dry? For our underwater pictures, we've brought our little submarine camera. It fits onto a platform inside a steel cylinder, made especially to resist water pressure and the advances of brazen mermaids. Just as the props are weighted, so must the performers be. The anklets are just heavy enough to do what their parents found extremely difficult, keep them under. Even the garlands have to be made of leaden flowers. Well, now we're all set and the camera's fixed, so let her go, George. Swim up, swim up, swim up for the greatest, slickest, grandest, loveliest, daintiest, and wettest circus in the world. Mussolowski, famous strongman, can raise anything except a couple of pounds in a hurry. Wonder if he's got any cigarette pictures. The hula hula, and her mother told her never to sit on wet grass. He's so strong he can break a promise with his little finger. And now for the most sensational, most stupendous, most ridiculous tight wire act in the universe, or thereabouts. Sit back and gasp at the amazing skill of these daredevil sprites. Did we say tight wire? That's not the only thing that's tight. Allez, up! La Belle Maggie Smith. She started by walking on air and then on thin ice. But now she's as used to a wire as a telegraph boy. Did you ever see such a saucy seesaw? They may take a lot of money, but they can't take a single breath. Gee, that's a good idea. These hot dogs are made from water spaniels. And they say the hot dog man sunk all his capital in floating his business. My, my.
Okay, here we go.
Standard deep sea.
Let me go. There we go. Nope. There we go. I knew it was going to be a little glitchy, y'all. So that little film has a lot of information in it. Like for example, that was Newt Perry. He was Mussolowski in that film. And he got an idea actually for the water hoses for the air hoses that the mermaids would use at Weeki Wachee from those hard hat divers, right? Because hard hat divers would have the air pumped into their helmet. And so he just got rid of the helmets and had the mermaids learn how to use those air hoses later when he went to Weeki Wachee. That was a later development, but he actually started doing it at Weeki Springs when he moved up there. And just the underwater, craziness, he's developing this whole aesthetic, about putting on these shows underwater. And this is Ginger Stanley here. She met Newt Perry. She actually became a Weeki Wachee mermaid before she went back to Silver Springs and became like the it girl over there. Ginger Stanley was in a beauty contest, and that's where Newt Perry found her. When he opened Weeki Wachee, he went places like beauty contests looking for swimmers. And so he hired her out of there, and she worked at Weeki Wachee, and then she ended up going back to Silver Springs, where she worked there for a very long time. And she would do these underwater shots there with Bruce Moser. There's Ginger, and that's probably Bruce Moser behind her. If you know anything about Florida underwater photography, you know the name of Bruce Moser. He was an amazing human being. He was the photographer at Silver Springs for over 50 years. And after he met Newt Perry in the 30s, he went down to Silver Springs he was going to take some photos of a Tarzan show, and ended up kind of staying, and he developed all these underwater ideas himself, after meeting Newt Perry and carrying on that whole idea of underwater performance. And these are some other shots. That looks like Newt Perry to me, with a woman in a hula outfit. And then in 1941, because of Newt Perry's fame, he was kind of famous in Florida already for his work in film and stuff. He was a good person to go to if a filmmaker wanted to make a film. And so this man named Ed Ball built a lodge up at Weeki Springs in the 30s, in like 1937. But in the 40s, he asked Newt Perry, would he come up to Weeki Springs and run the lodge and help promote it? And so Newt Perry did. He moved to Weeki Springs and started managing the lodge. And as soon as he got to Weeki, he started looking for underwater performers. That was what drove him, was performing underwater. And at the time, you had the Florida College for Women, and they had a synchronized swim troupe called the Tarpon Club. And so he went up to Florida College for Women and got these young women to come out there and perform, synchronized swim shows on top of the water. And this is a scene. They were actually filming a newsreel. I know he did at least a couple of newsreels. One was called Campus Mermaids. They're buried in a vault somewhere. Here's another still shot of that. There he is with the probably Tarpon Club girls. But he was also working with teenagers, which I'll get to in a minute. But this is a scene from a show they were performing out at Weeki Springs back in the 40s. And this is that mechanism that you saw in the film we just watched. Newt Perry actually called this thing the hole in the water, because underwater cameras had not been invented yet, right? So they had to create a a way for the cameraman to get underwater and to make films. And so they created this device he called the hole in the water. And so obviously this is up at Weeki Springs. And there's Newt Perry. He also created these little, I don't know, they call them air stations. Basically, you have compressed air that goes into the top of this little thing that looks like a post office box. And so they put a few of these in the springs at Weeki, and he trained a bunch of teenagers to come down there. And this is one of the teenagers. A couple of the teenagers that Newt Perry worked with, Rico Browning was one. Rico Browning was a student at Leon High School, and that's where Newt Perry would go to get these kids to come down on the weekends, and he would train them to perform underwater. And Rico Browning would later go on to do the double in Creature from the Black Lagoon films. He did all the underwater work. And also he went on to write Flipper. You know, he was a filmmaker in his own right as well. He worked with Ivan Torres Studio, became the president. And so he was very involved in Florida film and filmmaking. So that's how he got involved, was because of Newt Perry. And my friend Nancy Tribble also worked with him, and she did a lot of underwater work as well. And these are some of the teenagers from Weeki Springs, and you can see one of those little air stations in the background. They ended up having to take them out because a lot of soldiers would come out there during the wartime, and apparently one soldier dove pretty deep into the spring and got into one of those airlocks and ran into some trouble when he was coming out, and so they had to remove them from the spring. And this is Newt Perry with this little house he built. It's like it's not glass, but some kind of plastic. And that was a house he built for the kids. When they were performing underwater, they would get cold. That's one thing about Florida Springs. They're pretty chilly. You know, they range from mainly around 70 degrees, 72 degrees, somewhere in there. And the water is pretty chilly, and it stays that way all year, the same temperature. And so when you're performing underwater for any length of time, you get really cold. And so he built this little warming house for them. They would swim into it from underneath and warm up in there, and then get back in the water and perform some more. And this is a still from a little short film they made where they had a picnic underwater at Weeki Springs. It's actually, you can find this film online. They may even have it at the Florida Archives. Basically, these kids were in a jalopy, and they drove the jalopy into the spring, and then they had a picnic. And as you can see, they're eating and drinking. These are all things that, you know, Newt Perry's developing for when he opens Weeki Wachee, eating and drinking. They even had a fire. They would smoke underwater. You know, they would drink and eat, do all these things. And here's a couple of kids. This photograph actually made it into National Geographic, and they were just putting on makeup underwater. Now, this was from a beauty contest they had at Weeki Springs. They actually had an underwater beauty contest there. And this is it. This is the clip. That's Newt Perry right there smoking a pipe. And Nancy Tribble's in this film too. And this is at Weeki Springs newsreel underwater beauty contest. Let me make sure the sound's working. Okay.
Yeah. Florida, in case you didn't know it, has long been famous for mermaids, and the latest news of them comes from a place called Weeki Springs, where they recently held an underwater mermaid beauty contest. When the judges had made their decision, the mermaids insisted that the coronation itself must be held underwater, so one of the judges, rather ungallantly smoking a pipe, went down with Miss Mermaid to crown her as desired. How does he keep the pipe going underwater? Ah, well, you'd have to go to Florida to know the answer to that one.
Okay, there we are. There are a couple of things in that. The smoking underwater, how they did that, they would put a little drink of milk in their mouth and hold it. And then, you know, it looks like smoke. And Delee Perry, who is Newt Perry's daughter, told me that they would take BBs, and they would put them in a coffee can, and then like a coffee pot. And then when you poured them from a distance, it looked like coffee from a distance. So he came up with all these ideas of things that would look like they were real on film. When they filmed them and put them in the movie theaters, so people would believe that they were doing these things. And every year, both at Silver Springs and at Wakulla Springs, they would have Thanksgiving dinner underwater. And I saw an unedited clip of one of those, and it was kind of funny because they would be underwater eating turkey and drinking coffee and all that, and then all of them would kind of float to the surface. So all you would see were their legs, and they would get a gulp of air, and then they would come back down, and then film some more, and then splice it together so it looked like a continuous thing. But it was kind of funny. And I think, when Newt Perry used the air hoses, it did away with the whole having to swim back to the surface to get air, or even to go in one of the air stations. So that was one of the, I can't think of the word, but that was one of the innovations that he came up with. Now here you have an elephant in the water at Wakulla Springs, and there's Newt Perry over there. When Newt Perry moved to Wakulla Springs, that's when Johnny Weissmuller and I guess the company decided they would start filming some Tarzan movies at Wakulla Springs. So they filmed some up here at Wakulla. And so if you take the boat ride, they'll show you all the places where Tarzan was. And so Johnny Weissmuller actually stayed at the lodge down there. And the story was that he would throw open the windows in the morning and do his Tarzan yell and, get everybody going. This is just some stills or shots from when they were there filming Tarzan films at Wakulla Springs. And there's Rico Browning. Rico Browning was also, Rico was, like I said, was the double for the creature in all the underwater parts. And how he came to get that role was by the time this happened, he was a college student. And Newt Perry was out of town. And the company wanted to come to Wakulla Springs to scout the location. And so Newt Perry asked Rico Browning, would he go pick them up at the airport and then take them down the river and show them the location? And so he did. And when he was in the boat, when they were floating down the river, they asked him, would he mind diving in and swimming for them underwater so they could get a sense of what it looked like. And so when he did, they saw that he had this unique swim stroke. And if you watch Creature, you'll see that unique swim stroke Rico had. And so they asked him to be the underwater creature. And so he did for all the films. And he's still, I don't think he's feeling that great right now, but he was, up until recently, was going to a lot of creature conventions, very involved in that. And there he is with Ginger Stanley. And like I said, Ginger started as a Weeki Wachee mermaid, and then she did all these other things. She doubled in on one of the Esther Williams movies. She doubled in The Creature from the Black Lagoon. She did a lot of things in her own right. But Rico Browning, I think of all the people, probably had the most, in terms of his own career, totally, if he hadn't met Newt Perry, his life might have been completely different because, like I said, he became a film person, and he was inducted into the Florida Artist Hall of Fame for his work on all these different projects like Ivan Tours, Gentle Ben, all those things, Sea Hunt, all those things. And then, so what happens is when Newt Perry's at Wakulla Springs, he's developing all of his ideas, all of his underwater performance ideas. And he really wanted his own spring. He was asking around, for people, do you know where I can go to have my own space? And this guy told him, he said, there's two springs on the west coast of Florida. One is Weekly Washing, and the other is Chester Whiskey. And Chester Whiskey was actually Chassawitka. And I actually met a guy a couple of weekends ago. I was in Inverness, and he pronounced Chassawitka. He pronounced it Chester Whiskey, and he called Weeki Wachee Weekly Washing. Okay, and I wondered if there was a connection because one of the mermaids I interviewed told me that before Weeki Wachee became a mermaid place, the mom would go up there and do her laundry on the weekend. So I wondered if they actually did jokingly call it Weekly Washing. So this was, Newt Perry went down there, found the spring, dove in. He took Rico Browning with him. And there were a lot of things in the spring that had to be lugged out, like bed springs and all kind of stuff, cars people had thrown in there. So they cleaned it up, and then they sink a spring they sink a theater into the edge of the spring. And that's how the show started. And it was pretty immediate. It was pretty immediately like exciting, to people to want to go there. One of the things that you have to remember is that scuba wasn't a popular thing. I mean, it was just being invented at the time. So for you to be able to go into a little theater and look out into the spring was pretty remarkable. And I'm sure that Newt Perry being at Silver Springs and being at Wakulla and seeing those glass bottom boats, and how you could look underwater and see things, it was pretty exciting to people. And I think he just took that glass bottom boat idea, flipped it on its side, and put it in, put his theater into the spring like that. And this is a photo of one of the very first brochures. And my friend Nancy Tribble is on the bottom here. This is her doing their famous Adagio pose. And that pose is recreated on the statue outside of Weeki Wachee. And it's a famous pose that the mermaids do in every show. They end the show by doing this pose, and they float up. And this is Newt Perry with the newsreel people. And this is inside the very first theater. You can see how small it was. I never could get an exact description from people. Some people would say it seated 100 people. This doesn't look like it could seat 100 people. But it was small, but it could still hold, I guess, probably 50 people maybe. And this is a picture. You can see the underwater theater in the distance back there. And there's my friend Nancy Tribble here, and they're taking Gray Pet into the water. And what they would do is they would take these sodas into the spring and stash them in there. And then during the show, they would eat and drink underwater. And that was a big, big highlight of the show, was eating and drinking underwater. And if you think it sounds easy, try it. It's really hard. It's almost impossible to do unless you know exactly what you're doing. And there's my friend Nancy. I think she's eating grapes in this picture. They ate everything. They ate spaghetti, they ate watermelon, they ate turkey. They ended up settling on bananas because bananas were just an easier fruit, to eat underwater. So they kind of settled on that. Now, this is another one of the early postcards from Weeki Wachee. And this group of women here are actually the Aquamaids or Aquabelles. The Aquabelles were a swim troupe from St. Petersburg. Again, Newt Perry, when he opened Weeki Wachee, he needed mermaids. And so he was trying to find people to come out there and perform. And so he went over to St. Petersburg and met this troupe of swimmers. And he invited them to come over. And they would do synchronized swim on top, but they would also perform underwater as well. And so they became Weeki Wachee mermaids too, in addition to being the Aquabelles. And this is another photo of 3 of the Aquabelles in a very early postcard from Weeki Wachee. You can kind of get a sense of the shows they would have at the time. When the theater was first sunk underwater, they didn't have access to sound underwater. And so they would pretty much go underwater and do ballet. And it was just really amazing to see. And this was another photo from one of the mermaids named Diane Wyatt McDonald, who was very helpful to me. And she had an amazing scrapbook. And in this photo, you can see one of the young men, because they did have male performers. You just didn't get to see a lot of them, obviously, because the women, they were the mermaids, I guess. And you'll notice, too, that they're not wearing tails. They didn't wear tails in the early shows because there was not material that they could wear, like lycra. Those kind of stretchy fabrics hadn't been invented yet. And so there wasn't a kind of material that they could use to swim underwater safely in. And in the background, you can see the airlock that Newt Perry sank in there for them to swim in during the shows when they were in between acts. And there's my friend, Diane Wyatt McDonald, in summer of 47. I really love this picture of her just being out there in the spring. This is just a promotional photograph, probably, that went out into the papers. Weeki Wachee. And this was another one. And you can see they had 9 shows a day in the heyday of Weeki Wachee, 9. pretty incredible. And these are some shots from the very early theaters. You can see them underwater. And you can see how intensely people are looking at them. And again, just remember that watching them perform underwater was like watching someone go to the moon at the time. It was a pretty impressive act. And so here's a movie poster from Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid. And what happened is after Newt Perry opened Weeki Wachee, he got a call from Universal Studios, and they said, you know, we want to film a mermaid movie. Do you know any great locations? And of course, he's like, Weeki Wachee, come on down. And so they did. They came down, whole movie crew. It was really exciting, you know, to everybody to have this huge movie, this whole movie crew come to Weeki Wachee. Ann Blythe showed up, and there she is. She was the movie star, and these are the Aquabelles surrounding her, getting autographs, and she was the star of the show. There she is, swimming with Newt Perry, and there she is, y'all. When you put on a mermaid tail, it renders you incapable of walking, and so they would have to carry her to all the spots where they were filming. And my friend Ed Darlington told me a funny story about how he had to carry her shoes for her wherever she went, in case she got out of the tail and needed to put her shoes on. And he was enamored with her, but he was so afraid to say he didn't talk to her at all. He said he followed her around and never said a word to her. And in the background, you can see one of the mermaid doubles. And in fact, my friend Nancy Tribble-Benda was one of the doubles for the mermaid. She did some of the underwater work. And there's Nancy. She lived actually down the street from me here in Tallahassee. She passed away a little while back, but she was a big help to me too with the book. And this is her. They had a promotion for Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid over at Tampa in the square, in the courthouse square. And Newt Perry took this water tank over there, and Nancy, who's sitting on top of the tank, would get inside the tank, and she would smoke cigarettes and eat and drink. And like I said, the cigarette was a piece of chalk. And she would just take a gulp of milk and then pretend to be smoking. Obviously, they didn't smoke during the shows. And obviously they wouldn't do that now, but that was one of the things they did back then. And there's Nancy inside the tank. I love that picture. And there she is in the tail. And that tail was made by Bud Westmoreland. He was a big costumer out in Hollywood, and he fashioned this tail, and it was about like a $20,000 tail, so they could put that on underwater. And when they were filming Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, and they sank a castle into the water, the fish left. All the fish swam out of the spring. It kind of alarmed the fish, and so the filmmaker, when they were filming it, you couldn't tell it was underwater, and because the water was so clear. And so the filmmaker said, y'all are going to have to bring some fish back up here. And so what they did is they went down the river and they netted a bunch of fish and then brought them back up to the spring. But they also took fish roe and smeared it on this tail, so that when the mermaid was underwater in this tail, the fish roe would attract the fish. And so they would be all around her, so that it would be believable that she was underwater. That's how clear the water was at that time. And another issue with the fishtail, once they put fish roe on it, is Nancy told me the story about how they would hang those mermaid tails. They had a couple of them. They would hang them up on the sawhorses to dry at night, and the bears would come out of the woods to attack the tails. And she told me that story, and I was looking through some microfilm newspapers, and I actually came across a little clipping about it. That actually did. She wasn't just making it up. Yes, it did in fact happen that the bears would come out of the woods to attack this mermaid tail. I thought that was kind of funny. And this was Nancy had this amazing scrapbook, because she actually got to go out to Hollywood and work on the sound stage out there. And so this was a scrap from her scrapbook. You know, I mean, a scrap. This is a page from her scrapbook. She has a curl off the mermaid wig, the pins, and then the netting that was used to hold the wig on. And this is just another slide from Weeki Wachee. And here you can see some of the acts, like how they would do the acts out there. you know, they're not wearing the tails, but they're totally mermaids. They fed the fish. That was one of the major acts they did during the show, was to feed the fish. And the fish got so used to it that they would come up the river to get fed. And this was a famous photo. They actually used this on the photo book. And it's also been used on a lot of albums and everything like that. But it was made by Tony Frizzell. And it was one of the very first fashion shoots that was done outside in nature. And so it was made at Weeki Wachee. And that's why they put it on the cover of the book. And this is another shot of performing underwater. And you can see how beautiful it is. It looks a lot different now because of all the algae in the water. But back in this particular time, the water was so clear, it looked like air. It really did. And there's my friend Nancy. And Nancy loved this photo. And this is one of my favorite photos of her too. She said it really exemplified she called it the floating, flying feeling that you get as a mermaid. And that's one of the things that attracted a lot of these women to perform underwater there. And they all, if you look at mermaids, they all look so natural underwater. And it's very hard to look natural underwater. My son, he tried to do it 100 times. He would blow his cheeks out like that and squint his eyes. It's very hard to do. And not only that, but you have to be an incredible athlete to be a mermaid. So there's a lot behind the scenes stuff that goes on. And they make it just look gorgeous. And a lot of the mermaids I talked to said the same thing. It was like you feel like you're flying out there. It's an amazing feeling to perform underwater like that. Here they are. Here's a mermaid eating an apple. You can see the hose up close, what it looked like. Just another shot, theater. There's a banana eating picture. And this young lady was the youngest mermaid ever. And I came across this photo after the first book was published. I was giving a talk down in Apalachicola, and this man came up to me with a scrapbook, and that was his mother. And she was friends of Newt Perry. And so basically this little girl would go to Weeki Wachee in the summer, and while she was down there, they trained her to perform underwater. She never got to be in any shows, but she learned how to use the hose. And it speaks to what a good teacher Newt Perry was. And he could get people so comfortable that they would go underwater, 40 minutes at a time and perform, without flinching and making themselves look absolutely beautiful doing it. More mermaids. And here's mermaid school, because mermaids had to go to school too. And I think the next one is a little video from the Florida Archive. So let's watch this.
Beauty.
Sorry, I wanted to make sure the sound was
in
working.
the deep. The fascinating beauty of the underwater world, where we explore the mystery of ancient fable. The fable of mermaids who live at Weeki Wachee. Two of the stars in this world's greatest underwater spectacle swim out to perform graceful acrobatic routines in the crystal clear water, set against the background of Florida's underwater Grand Canyon. Weeki Wachee is the largest single spring in Florida, pouring forth 168 million gallons of water daily, and always at a temperature of 74 degrees. In this magnificent setting, the world's most highly skilled underwater artists entertain daily in a performance of beauty and daring. Viewed from the new $1 million underwater theater in year-round air-conditioned comfort. The great conch shell at the canyon's rim is actually an airlock where mermaids await their cue, breathing air until they emerge to perform their excitingly beautiful routines. Thrills that have been enjoyed by millions of people. body is weightless because of the greater density of water over air. And these two charmers demonstrate their skill by going up or down without apparent movement, simply by controlling the body's air content. Now, a pretty mermaid swims toward the theater to give us a closer look at one of the most unusual scenes ever filmed. It's snack time, and this proves that fish do not fear people. These friendly little fellows have learned that every hour during the day, at every performance, food will be served, and by such a charming hostess. Mermaids get appetites, too. This is probably one of the most difficult feats of all the unique features at Weeki Wachee, actually eating underwater. Drinking underwater, too? Of course, but you have to be real thirsty. How was it? Now, a daring mermaid attempts a deep dive to the bottom of the canyon. She breathes hard into the mask to equalize the pressure on her ears. She begins her dive, down into the depths, 117 feet below the surface, equal to the height of a 10-story building. Inhaling the life-giving air from the hose, and then forcing air into the mask to balance the increasing pressure on her ears. For every 33 feet she descends, the pressure on her body increases over 14 pounds per square inch. She fights the tremendous current surging up from the spring, over 116,000 gallons a minute. It's a battle every foot of the way. Now, at the bottom, wedged in the rocks to withstand the upthrust of the spring. Then soaring up, riding the swift currents to the surface. Pausing in graceful underwater acrobatics, taking time to adjust gradually to the lessening pressure as she approaches the top. Floating in the luminous beauty of water and sky. One of the wondrous beauties of nature combined with skill and daring. Truly beauty in the deep at Weeki Wachee on Florida's Sun Coast.
Okay, that was, let me make sure I did that right. Yeah. That film it shows you, and that was after ABC bought Weeki Wachee. ABC, American Broadcasting Corporation, bought Silver Springs and Weeki Wachee, and they built the $1 Million Theater. And that's when they started adding music to the shows, because then they had, at that point in time, they had speakers that could be placed underwater so the mermaids could hear the music, and they hired a choreographer, and they started making elaborate props, and you'll see some of those images in a minute. And so the deep dive is it is this kind of cool thing, because they dive really deep down, and you can see what athletes they are to be able to do that, and then to stay under there, and then to slowly come up. And so it's pretty impressive and I think they still do that in the shows today. So it's pretty cool. There's this was just a funny shot of Ginger Stanley cutting up with her friends out there. They're pretending to drink beer and smoke cigarettes. I'm sure they didn't do that, y'all. And this is a shot of the airlock that in that shell before you saw that big shell airlock. This is what was underneath it. And so they would use that in various ways. But at one point they had mermaids on the moon, and they used it as a spaceship. And this was during the heyday, and there's the new theater behind them. It was a beautiful clamshell roof, which at some point in the 70s, somebody had the brilliant idea to cover it up with wood. And now that the state owns it, they've redone it, and it's back to its original state. So they had a lot of mermaids out there at one point, 20, 25 mermaids at a time on staff during the heyday. And this is inside the $1 Million Theater. Oops, went too far. This is inside the theater, so you get a sense of how big it was. And this is the theater that's there now that you can go check out. Just another shot of beautiful mermaids for the postcards. There, for a minute, they had some. They were canning up some water down there, Weeki Wachee water. And this woman's name is Loretta Jefferson. She had worked for one of the circuses. I don't know if it's Barnum and Bailey Circus or something, but they hired her to become a choreographer. And so she could actually, give them directions from inside the theater, and to help them choreograph shows and stuff. And there's my friend Bonnie. Bonnie, I have a sweet spot in my heart for Bonnie. Bonnie helped me on the last book project I did. She was my co-author, but she helped me a lot on the very first book. She worked at Weeki Wachee longer than any other person. She actually worked there 37 years and was a mermaid for 18 of those years. So she did everything there. She choreographed shows. She made her own shows. She later worked when they had birds and different other animals out there. She worked with them. And here she is. And when ABC built this theater, they built this hole in the back. And so this is behind the stage, behind where the mermaids go in. It's a room where the mermaids go in and they jump into this hole and it goes down about 15 feet and then it shoots out into the spring. And so they would have to swim through this tunnel, to get into the water. And that was nerve-wracking. You're in a dark tunnel. Sometimes it had light, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes your hair would get hung up on the things that were hanging down. Sometimes big old catfish would swim in there. So it took a lot of nerve. It took a lot of nerve to be a mermaid. And there's Bonnie in that hole. And there's the airlock covered with the big conch shell. And there's my friend Bonnie on one of the props. Like ABC had a lot of money, so they could afford to build all these really amazing props, and they would change the shows all the time. And Bonnie was a big part of that. This was a behind the scenes mermaids cutting up. They have Spanish moss on their heads. I really thought that picture was funny. Bonnie and her friends, they would make their own movies outside of Weeki Wachee. They would do their own little movies they made, little takeoffs on things. One of them was called The Sound of Mucus. This was from, y'all, which one is this with the gator in it? My brain is not working. Is it Alice in Wonderland? These are the mermaids playing the fiddle underwater. I'm just going to show you guys a bunch of postcards. This was one of the giant props they had. It had a motor in it. Kind of float around the spring. There's Bonnie feeding the fish at the fish cafe. This was from Alice in Wonderland. Obviously, a takeoff on Alice in Wonderland. There's another shot of Bunny. This was Mermaids on the Moon with twins, Holly and Dolly. They actually lived in Orlando. Well, actually, they lived in Castleberry, and they had a bar down there, a sports bar. And that's where I interviewed them for the book while they were waiting on tables. And these are just some more shots of the really cool, elaborate sets and stuff they had down there. You can see how they got their feet hooked into this thing to keep them from floating up. Snow White, Seven Dwarfs. And it was actually during a Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs performance that two mermaids drowned. They didn't die, but they were hospitalized for about a week afterwards. One of them had been off, and she wasn't even supposed to be swimming, but she wanted to swim a show. And so she dove into the spring, and she went into an airlock that had not been in use for a while, and there was a noxious gas in there. And she passed out, and she passed out, and then another mermaid swam in to get her. And when she went inside the airlock, she passed out. And luckily, there was a sound technician that recognized that they weren't cutting up; they were in danger, and they pulled them out. And they were both hospitalized. And that's when the mermaids actually went on strike. There was a picture in the newspaper of them up in New York City in their bikinis, striking in front of ABC's office because they didn't have the safety mechanism in place. They didn't have any of the things they needed to save someone in that situation. And after that happened, the mermaids had to be certified divers to perform. So that changed things a little bit down there. Another shot. There's Bonnie, and this photo was in the tackiest postcard book. And they would also take pictures for, if it was like haircutting week or camera week, they would get underwater with these oversized things and make photographs to send to newspapers. Because back in those days, y'all, newspapers needed material. And so they would love to post these photographs in the newspaper. Camera, oversized camera, probably for camera week. There's Bonnie playing baseball underwater. And then Elvis Presley came, and that was one of the highlights too. Elvis Presley was filming Follow That Dream in Crystal River, and so they invited him to come to Weeki Wachee, and he came. And of course, girls from all over the country arrived at Weeki Wachee too. And one of the newspaper articles said they trampled all the flowers to get close to Elvis Presley. And they came into the theater, and Elvis was there, and they had the Weeki Wachee Springs Underwater Presley fan club. And so Elvis Presley thought this was pretty cool. And you can see him here inside the theater. He bought everybody record albums and handed them out to all the mermaids, and even to some of the maids that worked at the hotel. And Elvis thought that he didn't understand why they built Weeki Wachee where they did. He asked one of the managers, why didn't you put it somewhere like Madison Square Gardens or, up in New York somewhere? He didn't understand that it was a Florida spring, and you can't relocate those. He thought it was a man-made place, but it was a Florida spring. And this just shows you, this is a Florida road map, 64, how big Weeki Wachee was. Weeki Wachee was a huge attraction. Like I said, they had 9 shows a day in the highlight, in the heyday, people standing outside to get in. So it was a huge, huge attraction. There's another photo to give you an idea of how many mermaids they had on staff. And this is the beginning and the end. You might wonder, who are these people? That is Dick Pope from Cypress Gardens, and that is Roy Disney. This was when Roy Disney was scoping out places to put Disney World, okay? And he came, the urban myth, I don't know if I've heard multiple stories about it. Dick Pope told a story that Roy came down there, Roy Disney's looking for places to put Disney World. And he went to Cypress Gardens and apparently went into Dick Pope's office and called his brother Walt and said, you won't believe it. This guy has a garden. People are lining up to pay money to get in. I think I found an area where we can have our, Disney World. And initially, all of the attractions thought that it was a fabulous idea. They really did. There's Dick Pope at the Cinderella Castle when it was being built. They thought it was going to be good for them to have Disney World in Florida. And part of the reason they thought that, and Dick Pope was a big promoter of other attractions. What they would do is they would promote each other. So Dick Pope, like if you went to Cypress Gardens, on his brochures, he would even say, we are near Bok Tower, we are near Silver Springs. And so they would promote other attractions. And so they felt like there was enough love for Florida to go around. And so they thought it was going to be a good thing. In the beginning, when Walt Disney World was first built, it actually did increase traffic at these other places, only because Walt Disney World had a limit to how many people could come in per day. And so there would be an overflow crowd, and the overflow crowd would go to, Weeki Wachee, they would go to Silver Springs, to Cypress Gardens. But that changed once Disney World started building more and more worlds, and they kept adding to their footprint, and then they built hotels, and then they just really got greedy and snagged up. They wanted, when somebody came to Florida, they wanted them to come to Disney World and not leave, and that's what started happening. And that was the demise of many of these smaller attractions. And so by the time I got to Weeki Wachee, when I was working on my novel, this was the crew they had. They had a handful of mermaids performing shows. And these are the mermaids I met, some of these women in this picture. when I went down to see the show. And this was a group of older mermaids. Like I said, when I went to Weeki Wachee, I happened to go just by happenstance on a day when the older mermaids were performing, and they enchanted me. You know, that's what happened. I got snagged up in the mermaid, the mermaid mania, and I fell in love with these older mermaids, and everybody did. People wanted to see them perform. It was pretty impressive, and it still is. They still perform about once a month, I think. And so that's how I got involved in, writing the book. I put my novel aside, and I ended up writing about the real mermaids. And I'm pretty happy I did that. And this is just a shot from, post-Disney manatees in the spring. And this is what, the website looks like now with the real elaborate tells for the photo shoots. And, now Weeki Wachee is a state park, and so the mermaids are actually park rangers. And you can go down there and see them perform. And I encourage you to go. If you haven't been to Weeki Wachee, you just have to go. It's impressive no matter what, to go. And also, I like to end with this slide. This is my friend Bonnie doing what she calls spring cleaning, because Florida springs are really a national treasure, and they have been damaged by human beings, the overflow of septic tanks, the runoff from our roads, all that stuff, the fertilizers that we put on our grass, all of that stuff goes into the Florida aquifer, and it causes algae to grow, and it creates problems in the springs. And so I think it's imperative, that we remember that and try to save the springs. And so I think they have been working on that at Weeki Wachee, to their credit. They have been working on that. So I encourage you, if you haven't been to Florida Springs, go to Weeki Wachee and then hit some of the other springs. And now I'll be happy to take some questions from y'all. I don't want to keep y'all too long here. So if y'all have some questions.
Yeah, we actually did get several questions. I pulled them out. So I think a lot of people like me are curious about just sort of some of the details of what it was like for the mermaids and what their experience was like. I mean, it's so interesting to hear all these stories. I myself am trying to wrap my head around the level of swimming skill and strength that they must have had to not only do one show a day, but to do several shows a day. I mean, they obviously were extremely strong swimmers, of course. So we do have several questions. Some of these you may have addressed in varying degrees, but I'll go ahead and ask them in case you have anything to add. But we have several questions about just the experience of the mermaids, and then we did get a few additional. So the first question we received was, how big was the spring, is the spring? For those of us who haven't been there, just to give us a sense of the scope, I guess.
Well, I know that, I can't say exactly footage wise. It's not the biggest. They say it's the biggest spring in that early video, but I don't think that's true. I think it's pretty deep though. It goes down. They would dive about 80 feet down. They would say 100 and something in the show, but they were really just diving down about 80 feet. It's pretty deep. It's not a huge spring though, like area wise,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm guessing like smaller than a football field area,
Oh, okay.
where the theater is. And then
Yeah.
of course it flows down the river. There's a Weeki Wachee River there. And but it's pretty deep. And when they do perform, they're actually performing about 15 feet underwater. The whole show is about 15 feet under the surface. And so they maintain, like in one of the clips, it showed them using breath as a way of controlling where their body is. And that's what they do. They didn't use weights. I know in the first film we saw, the circus film, they put weights on. These mermaids did not use weights. They used their breath to control where they were. So they're incredible athletes for sure.
Absolutely. Then that does sort of help put into context, because I assume some of our guests haven't actually been out there. So does help put it into context. Thank you. Someone else was curious, how long could they hold their breath for? I know we know they had the breathing tubes, but how long could they perform between having to use them?
Well, mermaids could hold their breath from anywhere from like 2 minutes all the way up to 5 minutes. Some mermaids could hold their breath for a very long time. And so they would pride themselves on being able to hold their breath for quite a long time. So there is that illusion of breathing underwater. There's that illusion that they're really breathing underwater, and they actually are breathing underwater because they're getting air underwater. They're not coming to the surface. And the air hose itself is compressed air, so they had to bite the end of it. And it's like probably like what you pump your tires out with, the compressed air coming out, and they would have to be careful how they did it. There were so many factors involved that it took so much skill to do what they're doing.
Yeah.
And like I said, looking good while you're doing it, that is really hard to do, to make your face just be completely natural.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked briefly about this. Someone asked, did anyone get hurt? And we know that was the case. A couple of mermaids were hospitalized. Was it a frequent occurrence? Was this something that was a major issue, or?
Oh, that was the one occasion where there was
Okay.
2 mermaids almost died. And I actually when I went to see my friend Bonnie right before she left Florida, one of the mermaids that was in that incident was there, and she told me a little more about it. Basically she said they would have drowned if the sound guy hadn't noticed that they were, because at first I think the audience thought they were playing, because they would cut up during shows sometimes, and if the sound technician hadn't noticed, wait a minute, they're not playing, and hadn't dove in to save them, they might not have lived. They were in the hospital for over a week recovering.
Wow. Someone asked, how could they see underwater without goggles?
Well, everything's blurry, if you go underwater. But what they do, and I was at a mermaid show, and this woman was sitting next to me, and the mermaid's looking straight at her, and you get a sense that the mermaid can really see you, but everything's blurry. But they create this image that they're looking right at you, but everything's blurry underwater unless you have goggles on. We're not like fish. Our eyes aren't equipped for that. So when you're underwater, things are blurry, but they can see a blur, but they make it look like they're seeing everything. So it's a pretty good, it's just a technique they're using to make you think, that they can see underwater.
Yeah. Let's see. You've answered a couple of the ones I had on my list. Someone wants to know, and I'm trying to monitor the chat because we're still getting questions in. So this is great. It shows that everybody really was really fascinated by the story. So that's awesome. Let's see. Do the shows still happen today? I know the answer to that, but I'll let you answer just in case.
Yeah, they still happen. Obviously not as many shows, maybe 2 or 3 a day now, I think. And they haven't changed a lot, since Weeki Wachee changed hands a number of times after ABC. It changed hands a number of times, and then of course you had Disney World come, and so things started going downhill. And at one point it almost closed, and that's when the mermaids launched the Save Our Tails campaign and saved it. And then it floundered there for a bit, and then the state came in and bought it. So I think now it's safe. It's not going to go anywhere, because it's iconic attractions. The mermaids are iconic. And so, but I would suggest looking at the website. I know that the coronavirus did affect they stopped having the shows, but they have shows year round, even in the winter, they're swimming. And so I encourage you to check the website and see it. I know that when they're at the height in the summer, for example, you have to get there really early to get a ticket, because people do get there to get the tickets.
Yeah. Do you happen to know, Lou, is the park or the auditorium on the National Register of Historic Places? Or on any sort of, even the Florida Register?
I feel like it should be, if it's not.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a push to put it, or if I don't know the answer to that. I know that they did restore it, because like I said, in the 70s, this company bought it and they put this hideous wooden roof over the beautiful clamshell roof. And then inside the theater, there was all this beautiful tile work that they covered with carpet. It's like, why? What were y'all thinking? And so they refurbished. So they did restore those things back. So it's back to its original state now.
Well, I mean, thank God. And I feel like that whenever they would go in and update things in like the 70s, they always just made it so much worse, and you got to go back in and fix it.
Yeah, you had to go back and fix it.
One of our viewers was a classmate to a mermaid who was working in the early 60s, it looks like, Carol Allison. She's curious if you ever came across her in your research.
I didn't. And that's the thing is like when you write a book about a place, like after you write the book, you meet like 1,000 more people.
Mhm.
There are probably like 1,800 people that were mermaids for various
wow.
lengths of time, you know, because some would just stay a few months and then go. And then
Mhm.
Bonnie was the one that stayed. Bonnie's story is incredible. She was there 37 years, 18 as a mermaid, you know.
Yeah.
And she said she quit performing because she just got too cold. She was just at that point was suffering from cold. But you know, they would sometimes they would want to be merged. They would develop ear issues, and it was because your ears are always underwater, and it's you know a lot of things like that. Girls showed up who wanted to be mermaids who couldn't even swim.
Yeah.
You know, they would
just wanted to
show
look
up
pretty
and they couldn't
yeah.
even swim. They wanted to be mermaids.
Well, and I mean, a very physically taxing job, obviously.
Oh, it is. And one of the things when I was doing the book, I got to hang out with mermaids after they performed. And the first thing they did, they would take a very hot shower because they were cold. You know, your body, you almost get hypothermia. And then they would eat. They would eat big piles of food because they were hungry, you know.
Well, the video said that it was the spring stayed 74, and I was thinking like, they say it like, oh, it's so warm, which yeah, compared to water up north it is, but I was still like, that would be so cold to be in 74-degree water for a length of time. My gosh.
Yeah, they say in different springs they give different temps. And I would say they range between like 70 and 74, but that's cold. If you're in the water for a long time, I think it's every 15 minutes your body temperature drops, and so that was one of the things that some of them just couldn't handle after a while is the hypothermia, you know, how cold your body would get, you know.
Yeah. Let's see. We still have some questions here, so let's see what else we can address. Rick asked, do you know anything about Perry's show that he had, the traveling show he had after Weeki Wachee? He says he's seen some photos and he knows that they had a big traveling tank. Do you know anything about that show?
No, well, I mean, I saw that when Newt Perry left Weeki Wachee, he went on to do that traveling show, and I actually have some letters in my file somewhere, Rick, that he had written to, I think it was Grantland Rice. He and Grantland Rice had a correspondence, and he mentioned this traveling show that he had, this aquatic swim show thing. He took a tank around. They had a kitchen in there and everything. That's all I know about it, though, really, or I don't know exactly how long it lasted, you know.
Yeah.
But I can scrounge around in my files and look for that stuff.
All right, I'm just trying to scroll through the chat here and see what came up while we were talking. A lot of people just thanking us, saying they loved the presentation. It was fascinating, encouraging others to go check out Weeki Wachee, which we would of course do as well.
Oh,
you may want to take a look at this chat when you get a second, Lou, because there's some people sharing some memories they have, which are really interesting. Yes, the program is recorded and we will post it on our website. If you check out our website, we have a page for our exhibition, Giants, Dragons, and Unicorns, the World of Mythic Creatures, which is this program is being offered in conjunction with that exhibit. And so on that page, we will at some point in the next couple weeks probably get the presentation up on our website to watch for everyone. We'll put the link on the page that has all of the associated stuff with that exhibit. Someone's asking if your books are available on Amazon. I did list all the books in the chat for anybody who's interested, and
they are.
Yeah, that's so. Okay. So her books are available on Amazon. Scroll up in the chat. You should be able to find all those titles. Let's see.
Somebody asked how many performed at one time. That varies. It depends on the show they're doing. A lot of times when they were just doing the old shows, it'd be 2 or 3 at a time out there performing. And now, if they're doing like now they do like the Little Mermaid show and stuff like that. So they have multiple performers, and they have male performers too. In fact, a very famous male performer is Eric Ducharme, who's known as the Mer Tailor. And he was a little kid growing up down near Weeki Wachee and fell in love with the mermaids and started sewing tails when he was like a little kid, pretty much. And, you know, he's been featured on all kinds of TV programs and stuff like that. And he's called the Mer Tailor, and you can check him out on YouTube and stuff. And he makes the like $1,000 tails, you know, they're pretty elaborate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually, if anyone's interested, I mean, obviously we encourage you to visit the History Center always, but while this exhibition is, I think we should go ahead and wrap up here. So I'll just share some information at the end for us to wrap things up. We actually have on loan from Weeki Wachee one of the historical artifacts that they house there, which is one of the mermaid tails. We currently have that in our exhibition, Giants, Dragons, and Unicorns, the World of Mythic Creatures. I did share in the chat, just back a little bit, a link to our events page. We have lots of other upcoming programming associated with this exhibition. So I'll just list a few here for everyone. On Saturday, December 4th, we actually have a free day. So if you want to come see the exhibition, it's a family day. So we'll have some fun activities for everybody, but you can get it in the museum free. So you can come check us out then. On December 12th, we have our program called, it's the first installment of Mythical Mornings. This one's theme is Dragons and Drafts. So this is our 21 and up weekend brunch event series that we're offering. So check out our website for all of that stuff. We will have, I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm trying to do two things at once, read the chat and my notes here. But the exhibition is running through January 23rd. So plenty of time to still come and see it. December 4th is a great time to do that. But if you can't make it, then do come and check out the exhibition. I would encourage everyone to search for Lou's books on Amazon. I know a lot of people were asking about your books in the chat, which is great. They are available on Amazon, so just search up her name in Amazon. And then I did add them in the chat earlier, so you can scroll back and find them if you've been here for a while. I think that's it. I feel like I've covered all the notes and questions we had in there that were kind of logistical things. So I guess just to close out, thank you so much, Dr. Vickers, for leading our talk today. I also want to thank everyone for attending the event today. We hope that you enjoyed the program. I will go ahead and throw just once again those links to our website in the chat for everyone. So anybody who hasn't grabbed those yet can go ahead and do that. And Dr. Vickers, did you want to say anything before we sign off here?
Thank you to everyone that showed up. And I know I'm half crazy, but you know, I hope I did a good job. I had a little dog on the floor here annoying me, but I know there's a lot of things that I can't remember everything. There were just so many amazing people that I met doing this project. And like I said, Newt Perry affected so many people's lives, you know, that he turned them into performers or they became film people and like me, I ended up writing about, like, if I hadn't known about Newt Perry, my career just took a whole different twist and turn because of him, you know?
Yeah. And I think that it's great to hear, you know, because obviously, you know, you've done all the historical research and all of that. You've written, you know, several books now about, you know, Florida tourism history. But you also just know all these people, you know, you've been there, you've talked to everyone, you're friends with them. And so it's really, you know, it's great to hear a presentation like this from somebody who has that firsthand experience, and it's like having a conversation. And so it's really fascinating. Thank you so much for facilitating today. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to hang out here for just a minute so everybody can get those links and scroll back and find your books and stuff, but feel free to sign off whenever you need to. Okay, Dr. Vickers?
Okay, well, thank y'all. And if anybody has questions, I teach at Tallahassee Community College. You can find me on their website.